We are so glad that you're here. It's a new year. We're excited to see what's going on in this coming year and looking forward to how God is going to be at work through Radiant Church. I'm just really excited about that, and I hope you're getting excited about it too. There's just kind of a general sense God's up to something. We turned a corner and momentum is building, and I am looking forward to seeing what lies ahead and all that we have to do. We're kicking off a new series today called as you can see in the back. And for those of you who stayed awake in school growing up, you might know that is what we call a prefix. You put it in front of a word, and it means essentially to do again. So if you look at reread, to read means you're going to read it again. Relook means you're going to re-look at it. You're going to look at it again. To remain means you're going to main again. Just kidding. That didn't work at all. So not every re in front of the word means that. But by and large, when you put re in front of a word, it means to do it again. This time of year is the time of year where we get to kind of evaluate ourselves. We look inside. We look at the goals we've set maybe from the year before and say, how did I do on that? Did I reach it? Did I get there? We look and say, what are those other areas in our lives we need to turn a corner on? How do we need to raise the bar in my life? It's just, there's something about this time of year that really puts us in that mode of evaluating and making changes and going forward. And I know this is true because I went to the gym a few days ago and there was not a treadmill available in that place, man. It was nuts. And this time of year is the time of year when gym memberships and college and university enrollment skyrockets because people naturally want to reevaluate their lives. They want to look at those areas that they can raise the bar and go forward in, and they make the move this time of year. And so we ask ourselves, hey, what are we passionate about? What's that thing that gets us up in the morning? What's that thing we have to do? For me, I've been evaluating that for the past few weeks. You know, I've been here about 6 months now, and so I've been even asking God, I'm like, okay, God, we've been in this get to know you phase, but very clearly we're going to be moving into the what's next. Where are we going? What vision, what direction do you have for us? Not only as a person, but as a church. And as a church, we're going to ask that question too, because we need to be asking, where's God taking us? What kind of God-sized dreams and God-sized vision is Radiant Church being called into? And so, how about you? Where are you at? How are you doing with questions like that? Are you asking that? Are you evaluating? What's going on in your life? Today, I want to open up quickly by looking at a church in the first century world. It was called the church in Ephesus. Now, the church in Ephesus was a church that was on fire, and they were enormously passionate. But if you don't know much about Ephesus, it was a city in the Roman Empire. It was noted by historians that it was second only to Rome in size and influence in their area. It was a large city of about 250,000 people, and it was essentially the power base for the Roman Empire to the Asian provinces. So it was a very important city to the Roman Empire. There was a church there, and it was started by a man named Paul. Paul was noted to plant churches all over the Roman Empire. If there was ever a guy who had clarity of passion and focus and what he was created to do, this man Paul was it, because he started planting churches everywhere he went. We don't even know to this day how many churches really he truly planted or even influenced the plant of. He just did it all over the place. He had enormous clarity. He had enormous passion in all that he did. And because he had enormous clarity and enormous passion, this church in Ephesus had enormous clarity and passion as well too. They were a huge force in influencing the culture around them. They were a part of that church planting movement. They equipped and resourced those churches in their region to be successful. Their passion and their vibrancy was contagious. This church that Paul would pastor at, he would pastor there for 2 years longer than any other church that we have a record of. He spent longer time there than he did at most churches. This church at Ephesus would later become the home base of operations for the Apostle John, who would use this to reach out into the world as well too. Believe it or not, Ephesus was also and would eventually become the home of Jesus' mother, Mary. She would set up base there as well, too. So it was a very influential city. There was a lot going on there. Later, after Paul leaves Ephesus to go off and do what he does, he would write a letter about 10 years later to the church in Ephesus that would make its way into the Bible. You know that book as Ephesians. It's a very influential church. It was a church that was on fire. It was a church that was getting things done. But we're going to read today, somehow over time, that kind of dwindled a little bit. Something happened, something crept in. And I want to look at that, but just to give you an idea of how passionate they were, how loving they were at first, I would encourage you in your free time during the week in your Bible study to read most of chapter 20 in Acts. It's about Paul saying goodbye, but it gives you this sense of just how passionate and how driven and how loving they were. But in Acts 20, verse 36, we see when Paul had finished speaking, he knelt down with all of them and prayed, and they all wept, and they embraced, and they kissed him. I mean, who wouldn't want to be a part of that church? I mean, who wouldn't want to be there, that they're so passionate they just wept and they cried and they didn't care what they looked like or what other people thought about them. They just lived their emotions and their feelings on their shoulder, and they loved each other. It was clear they loved God. It was clear they loved each other. What a great picture of this early church in Ephesus that Paul had been a part of. But this would not be the last time we would hear of that church. 10 years later, yes, Paul would write a letter, but we would hear of this church one other time too. And that would be in the very last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, where Jesus is having a conversation with John, who's writing down what Jesus has to say, and Jesus is talking to 7 churches. And one of those churches is Ephesus, that he writes to. I want to look real quick what he has to say to the church in Ephesus. This would be approximately about 30, 40 years later after we read this in Acts. In Revelation chapter 2, verse 1, it says this. This is the words of Jesus. He says, "To the angel of the church in Ephesus write, these are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand and walks among the 7 golden lampstands." It's just a picture of Jesus' glory in heaven. "I know your deeds, your hard work and your perseverance. I know that you cannot tolerate wicked people, that you have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not. You have found them to be false. You have persevered and have endured hardships for my name and have not grown weary." Now, had Jesus written that letter to Radiant Church, at this point we'd be feeling pretty good. That's not a bad letter to get. I mean, if Jesus had written that letter to us, hey, you've held firm, you've pointed out wickedness, and you've stood strong through hardships, way to go, Radiant. Way to go, church at Ephesus. But the letter doesn't stop there. In verse 4, he says this, "Yet I hold this against you. You have forsaken the love you had at first. Consider how far you have fallen. Repent and do the things you did at first." You see, this church had great passion. This church was great in their influence and equipping and resourcing. They were on fire at one time, but something happened over time. How about you? Has that ever happened? Are there times you can think back, man, I was really on fire, I was passionate, man, it was happening, I'm loving it, but you know what? Not feeling it so much today. It happens. It happens to people and it happens to churches. And I get it. There's things in life that have to happen. I mean, the reality is, yeah, sometimes you got to pay the bills. For those of you who have kids, you got to raise the kids. And I get it. Emergencies, tragedies, problems in life rarely make appointments. They just come. And you got to deal with them. You can't ignore them. It's life. But what happens is when we get caught up in what I call the tyranny of the urgent, when we get in a routine, when we get in a rut, what can happen over time is it can sap your passion. It can bring it out of you. You can lose sight of what's important. You can lose sight of why you're here and what you exist to do. You can get lost in that. And what we have to ask ourselves at a time of year like this, and really constantly, is where is that first love? Where is that thing I need to get back to? How do I regain my passion? Which means I have to ask you today, what are you passionate about? It's not something we sit around and think about. Not always. But I want you to think about that in the coming days and weeks. What are you passionate about? What's that thing that really gets you out of bed in the morning? What's that thing you have to do in life? I want us to spend some time doing that because we can get caught in the minutia, in the routine of life. Now, if we were an organization, and we are, but many of you work for organizations or you volunteer at one, this thing about who we are, why we exist, what we're meant to do, that's called a vision statement. Every organization has one, or should. So if you work for one or you volunteer for one, there's most likely a vision statement somewhere. You may not know what it is. Maybe you've not even heard it. But I guarantee you it's there, and it's the guiding principle of why this organization does what they do and why they're around and what they hope to accomplish. They're important, and vision statements, every organization needs to have one. A vision statement asks one very important question. That question is this: we exist to blank. At the core of a vision statement is that one question. We exist to blank. Now, I want to give you some examples of some great vision statements out there with companies that many of you may know. The first one, Amazon.com, who I think has a picture of me and my family in the back, are benefactors. But Amazon Prime's pretty awesome, is it not? I mean, you got to love that. Amazon's vision statement is this: to be the world's most customer-centric company. Simple as that. Or maybe you're familiar with Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Cherry Garcia. Great stuff. I love theirs. Making the best possible ice cream, but they don't stop there, in the nicest possible way. How cool is that? Great company. Another one, Disney, has probably the shortest and most succinct one I've ever heard: to make people happy. Disney exists to make people happy. Or Google, my search engine, is to provide access to the world's information in one click. And the last one is Instagram. Many of you may use that as for social media. Their vision statement is to capture and share the world's moments. It's why they exist. And some vision statements are shorter and some are longer. If you go look at Apple's vision statement, it's an entire paragraph long and will bore you to tears. But they've got it. It's important to them. All of them, no matter what, though, seek to answer that one question: we exist to blank. We exist blank. If I turn that around, though, and look at you, and we ask that question, what if I say you exist to blank? What will you fill that blank in with? Companies and organizations can have vision statements, but did you know you can have one too? What's your vision statement? I began to ask that question too. I'm the pastor of the church, I should know that. But at first, I could not answer that question clearly. I mean, I have a lot of ideas. I always have a lot of ideas. But with absolute clarity, I began to ask myself that. Why do I exist? Well, I exist to do what? And at first, I couldn't come up with the answer. It really bugs me, because I'm type A and I have ants in my pants. So, I mean, it's really bugging me. I was like, what is it, Lord? Come on. And I get it, man. We can come up with the best church answers. If you're not part of church, those who are in church, we can come up with the greatest churchy answers in the world. I exist to glorify God. We all exist to glorify God. That's not your vision statement. I exist to this or that. No, I mean, what is that unique piece that God's calling me towards? And so I was just I was just kind of frustrated about that, working through it. And one day part of it hit me. I had one of those aha moments. Have you ever had an aha moment? The light bulb goes off and you're like, ding, there's part of it right there. I had one of those aha moments. I was on a Skype call with several pastors throughout the U.S. that I do. It's just part of leadership development and just to keep in touch with each other and mentoring and things like that. And we were having that talk. And this particular day, the conversation was going, hey, what should the church be doing more of? And a lot of the pastors really focused in. One's like, well, we need to be feeding the poor more. And we need to be, it was around Christmas time, we need to help some people get Christmas presents with dignity that can't do that, and that's great too. And another one's like, we really need to be focused more on sex trafficking and what's going on in our community. I'm like, that's good, but while I'm hearing these things, I'm thinking, I'm not fully settled on that though. There's something missing, and I couldn't pick it out in my heart, and they just kept throwing some things out, and I remember one guy finally just says, he goes, I mean, isn't that why we exist? And I went, no. Yes and no. I said, at the core, we exist to introduce people to Jesus. The church, you and I, at our core, exist to introduce people to Jesus. Those things like feeding the hungry and sex trafficking and helping those in need are all wonderful things, and we should be doing those things because that is the heartbeat of Jesus. But when you really think about it, that is the ways and the means in which we introduce somebody to Jesus. At our core, we exist to introduce somebody to Jesus. And I'm not being crass, so hang with me here for a second. But this was the problem I had that I was having to fight through in my mind, because here's what I realized. Did you know you can feed a hungry person all the way to hell? Not being mean, I'm not being rude. But you can actually feed somebody and never tell them about Jesus. You can help somebody in need who's hurting, and we should do those things. Make sure you hear that from me. But if we forget to introduce them to Jesus, what are we doing? You can be nice to your neighbors. You can be the friendliest person in the neighborhood. You can be the nicest, sweetest person at work and in the community. But if we never actually introduce somebody to Jesus, what are we doing? This idea has kind of slipped into churches in the last few years. I'm not saying Radiant, but overall that kind of struggling with this idea that if you just show them Jesus, they'll somehow get it. But I got to tell you, having been in church most of my life and ministry for 15 plus years now, that has not been what I've observed. There comes a point when the rubber hits the road and you got to tell them about Jesus. Just being a nice person, people aren't always going to connect the dots. It may happen, but that has not been what I have observed is the usual. There comes a point where that person you're feeding and that person you're helping, that neighbor that you're talking to out in the neighborhood, there comes a point where you got to tell them about Jesus. We exist in our primary level to introduce people to Jesus. And I wrote that down in my journal. And yet I knew I wasn't finished. It didn't feel complete just yet. And so I began over the course of the next few days and week and so writing things down and crossing them out and ripping pages out and throwing them in the garbage and all those things we do when we're just like, I can't figure this thing out. There's something missing to this. And then the answer came in another meeting, a simple one, with a simple question someone asked me one day. We were just working through a difficult situation. It wasn't any big deal or anything, but they just looked at me and said, well, what are we going to do about this thing? And without thinking, I remember my answer was, well, we're going to do whatever it takes wherever God sends us. Ding. And I wrote that down in huge letters. I realized God had given me this amazing, amazing gift. I knew I had that vision statement, but the problem was this. Yes, we exist to introduce people to Jesus, whatever it takes, wherever God sends me. I had come up with my own vision statement, but then I realized this wasn't mine. Well, I was going to live it and be passionate about it, and it was mine. What God clearly said to me is, Jason, your vision statement is Radiant's vision statement. And that was not what I wanted to hear. I mean, it was good and everything, but you know what I mean? Because then suddenly the weight of it really settles in on you. At Radiant Church, we exist to introduce people to Jesus. Whatever it takes, and wherever God sends us. And what that means is everything we do, every activity, every mission, every idea has to have behind it the thought, how are we introducing people to Jesus in this process? And whatever it takes means that if it's not illegal or immoral, we're going to build bridges with the culture, whatever it takes. We will be a creative, innovative force in our community that wants to reach the lost, the hurting, those who need to know Jesus. We're going to be the church that does it. And wherever he sends us means this. While Radiant Church is an amazing, wonderful resource and light and influence in the East Des Moines area, I do not believe that is the limit of what God is calling us to. I believe God's dreams are bigger than East Des Moines. We will always be a force. We will always be a blessing in this community. But I believe God is calling us to shine our light out through the 400,000 people in Des Moines that need to know Jesus. And there are farm communities littering this map that have 75-year-old dead churches that need to see a live version of the gospel and realize Jesus Christ is still saving lives and he can change yours. That's the vision God is calling us to. And I haven't got a clue how to do it. But that is one thing I want to challenge you with. As you think through your vision, if the vision that kind of comes on your heart you think of is something that you can accomplish, it's not big enough. No vision should be accomplished only by your hands. If you've got a vision that you can do, it's not a supernatural from heaven above vision, because the vision God wants you to live are God-sized dreams that require God, so that at the end of the day, when that vision happens and the dust settles and it got done, the only answer to why is God. Not me, not my abilities, not what I've done. You have the honor and privilege to be a part of seeing God work, and you have a job to play. God has always used people and humans to carry out his mission to redeem the world. But at the end of the day, if your vision can be done by you, it's not a God-sized dream. And I want you and Radiant and all of us to experience a God-sized dream. So I'm going to ask you that question again. How will you finish the statement, I exist to blank? How will you finish that sentence in your life? I exist to blank.